Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I'm very happy to share the conversation I had with Lynn Tesser. Lynn is Associate Professor of International Relations at Marine Corps University. She has a focus on comparative politics, international relations, and history. She has a Bachelor's in Political Science from Reed College and a Master's and PhD in Political Science from the University of Chicago. She's received numerous fellowships from Fulbright Commission, MacArthur and Mellon Foundations, and she has taught many places around the world. She is the author of a handful of books, including the most recent, Rethinking the End of Empire, Nationalism, State Formation, and Great Power Politics. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. We start the conversation by talking about how we move from empire. Empire dominated the world for many, many hundreds and thousands of years, to nation states is what we have currently. What was that move, especially more recently? We define nationalism versus nation states, talk about sovereignty, modular nationalism. And much like her book does, we talk about some of the kind of case examples, if you will. We talk about rebellions in the Americas, both in the United States and up and down Latin America, and how there's a sort of mixed narrative there. It's not kind of a clean, neat story that we were kind of taught maybe in school. We talk about the Greek Revolution. Again, there's some prevailing theories about, what it was about and, how it was. And but she talks about the role that elites played in the Greek Revolution. We also talk about the Balkan region and Balkan states and Anatolia, post-Ottoman period. Talk about Armenia. We talk about empire today and many other topics. I have this interesting fascination with all things empire. I think it's deeply fascinating that we had one way of ruling and doing things for so many years, and now we basically don't have that anymore. And that's not to say that we should go back to it or, on the finer sides of empire per se. But I just think in terms of the shift of doing empire for so long, and then now we do nation states, is quite fascinating to me. And Lynn's book is just brilliant in showing kind of a more holistic, well-rounded story and narrative of what was going on in many of these states and many of these revolutions and many of the things that contributed to the downfall of many of these empires that we know. So she was just a joy to talk to. I really enjoyed it. She's got such a sharp mind, and I just loved downloading everything from her and in conversation. As always, you can find this conversation and all others at my Substack, convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also wherever you find your podcast, but Substack is the best way to find me. You can subscribe, you can like, you can share with your friends, all the things. You can also find this on YouTube as well. So support there is much appreciated. And now I bring you Lynn Tesser. I am here with Lynn Tesser. Lynn, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So you've written a wonderful book, which we'll get all into. The book is called Rethinking the End of Empire, Nationalism, State Formation, and Great Power Politics. It's out through Stanford University Press. So I'm very excited to talk all things empire and nationalism and different people groups and ethnic groups through history. So it will be a lot of fun. Before we get to all of that, kind of give me the snapshot of who you are professionally, academically, and what you're currently up to.
Right. Well, the snapshot might just be a little bit complicated because I've changed over time.
That's okay.
I finished my PhD in political science more than 20 years ago in 2003. And at that time, I considered myself a specialist on the politics of Central and Eastern Europe, and particularly East Central Europe, which means Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, which then broke up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and particularly under European Union expansion, which was really fascinating to me. And I was seeing, in my field research, some signs that European Union expansion sometimes actually seems to make nationalist politics more likely, which kind of ran against the conventional thinking of the time. But then more recently, I've changed, kind of broadened my interests. I've taught now for almost 11 years at one of the U.S. military colleges associated with the Marine Corps. Which reminds me, before I continue, I should probably give the usual disclaimer that my opinions, views, analyses are mine, and they're not representative of the Marine Corps, the Department of Defense, and so on. So I need to say that. But to continue, then, teaching at one of the military colleges introduced me to new literatures, new ways of thinking, and I think I brought some of that into the book, and it also, again, broadened my interests. My book that we're talking about today has chapters not only on Central and Eastern Europe, including the Balkans, but it also has chapters on the Americas, Asia, and Africa. And these are literatures that were, despite, for example, having lived in the Americas for most of my life, weren't very well known to me. So I would say now my expertise is summarized by the book's subtitle, which is Nationalism, State Formation, and Great Power Politics.
No, that's wonderful. Yeah, it's a topic that continues to fascinate me, and how different it can be, but also some of the similarities across the world at different points in time. So let's start maybe with empire. For many centuries, we had, I guess you could say, it was the time of empires, right? You had people will know the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Mongols before them. Obviously, many people know about the Roman Empire. If you go way back, you have the Assyrian Empire, you have the Persian Empire. So this was kind of how things were done. And of course, the Ottoman Empire, ended, basically around World War I, although people debate that. And then, I guess the British Empire is sort of dissolved, but not really. I don't know how that one works. But we don't really have empires that much anymore, at least not in the way that we knew them. So how did we get to this place from empires to nation states? And, when you look on a globe or you look on a map, you'll see lines drawn and you'll see the country of, the Czech Republic or Poland or Germany or whatever. But these didn't look that way, or at least the lines on the map didn't look that way, 150, 200 years ago necessarily. So yeah, how do we get from empire to nation states and then more nationalist kind of ideas?
Okay. Well, that's, of course, a huge question. And, intriguingly, when I was at my first full-time teaching position after I finished my PhD, I was asked to teach an Introduction to International Relations course, and this was the first time I would do that, and thinking about, well, how would I kind of cultivate interest in it? And so I asked this question, how did we go from a world ruled mostly by empires to a world of nation states? And judging, frankly, by the looks on the faces of my students, I think I was more interested in the question than they were. But nevertheless, I used it to kind of frame my course. But then I didn't really return to it until when I started this book project. And frankly, at the time, I didn't even know I was starting a book project. I was I was just exploring recent historiography. At the same time, I was reading a well-known book in nationalism studies, which is the sociologist Andreas Wimmer, his book, The Waves of War. And in it, he has a chapter based on a journal article that offers a new way of looking at how the world again went from rule by empires to rule by nation states. And part of his theory emphasizes nationalist mobilization within empire. And I think if you asked most scholars of nationalism or state formation, I think that they would echo Wimmer's argument, not only because he's very well known and influential, but it has kind of it's fairly easy to understand the idea that there were these stateless nations within empires that, thanks to the work of nationalist activists, developed consciousness as a nation, and then preferences for being or for having a state of their own. And through their activism, we have over the course of time the end of empire. Of course, you can find variations on that idea. Another well-known author on nationalism studies, Benedict Anderson, in his famed book, Imagine Communities. He talks about nations and nationalism as being modular, or as something that can be applied in different regions and different time periods. Although he tends to, his argument focuses on the importance of the Americas, of Creole nationalism, if you will. And the Creoles were the descendants of the European settlers in the Americas. And he argues that because of this Creole nationalism, we kind of get this proliferating ideas of nation and nationalism, or in other words, modular nationalism. So this, whether it's Wimmer or Benedict Anderson, we have this, I think, widely understood idea that, we have the end of empire because of nationalist movements. And that was the same thing I had thought until I started reading historiography. And I'm long interested in history. My first project, which I mentioned when I introduced myself, I was fascinated how, here I'm jumping around in time a little bit, in the World War II, post-World War II period in Central and Eastern Europe, there was a lot of what we might call ethnic unmixing. Of course, there's, the well-known genocide against the Jews, the killing of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, but less well-known perhaps than that is a lot of forced migration. And then after World War II, we have the Western powers agreeing to, in a sense, what was called at the time population transfers, mostly German minorities being moved from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, to make it less likely that Germany would be irredentist. In other words, would try and reclaim territory by saying, well, the Germans need to be protected. And we're seeing this, of course, right now with Vladimir Putin's claims of needing to protect Russians in Ukraine prior to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Of course, that idea was used even before that. So I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but I was initially fascinated by how important, in a sense, ethnic separation was for kind of the idea of making Europe peaceful. And then, of course, the idea for making Europe peaceful changes drastically with the rise of the European Union. So instead of kind of separating people into nation states, the idea for peace is having this broader European market with integration to make war less likely. So the idea is that with the French and the German economies being so intertwined, that they're less likely to go to war. So ultimately, part of my interest, I think, in historiography is that ideas about what brings peace can change substantially over time, and it may not have a lot to do with a deep analysis of what people on the ground in the countries concerned, what they actually think about. So in my book, I kind of wanted to challenge this conventional wisdom of, the end of empire comes because of nationalist movements that wanted independence and wanted the end of empire. What I found is that oftentimes, even right before recognition of new states out of empire, there might have been only a fraction of activists and rebels who were obviously nationalists. They had They spoke as nationalists. They talked about the need to protect the nation. But what I found is that oftentimes it's the leaders and the policymakers in whether it's the host empire or the third party state who may not have a very good grasp of what rebels and activists are thinking on the ground and from a distance. But with the rise of nationalism, it becomes easier for leaders and policymakers in the metropoles, the imperial metropoles, to see nationalism, to see national identity. And of course, there usually were activists that were nationalists, but they were often just a fraction of the kind of broader criticism of empire, ideas for reform. There could be other ideologies floating around. But once, we have these new states recognized, and according to my argument, again, they're recognized, well, they might be, for example, in the Balkans, they might be recognized simply to provide Christians with protection. So the Balkan states were often just recognized as Christian states, although at the same time, when different ethno-national identities are starting to develop. So I think ultimately over the course of time and in hindsight, we developed this sense that, well, it had to have been nationalism. It had to be these powerful national movements that broke apart empires. And we have that vision, I think, because nationalists were able to use the ideology of nationalism to establish legitimacy for many new states, and they could write history from a nationalist perspective. And this is something that scholars could latch upon. It's a fairly easy narrative to pick up. But what I find is that only the historiography coming out, mostly within the last 30 years, is much more attuned to the variety of identities, unrest, ideas for reform in the late days of empire, and that in most cases, there weren't these overwhelming nationalist movements that brought about the end of empire. So I'll stop there because I know I've kind of gone on at length, and you may have some questions about what I said.
So there's a few other, I guess you could say, introductory items. Your book is great because it's basically 5 big chapters. You have one on the Americas, one on Greece, one on the Balkans and Anatolia, and then you have one on Central and Eastern Europe and one Asia and Africa. So it's, in some ways, the chapters almost feel like long essays, which is nice because you could read one, and I mean there's a through line through all of it. But in the introduction, there's a few other things that you mentioned which I thought were super fascinating, and one of them is, I guess, about terms. And so a lot of the times people will get terms mixed up or misused. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but you do talk about some of the differences between nationalism, nation-statism, and nation-state. So you can define those, but I guess the main question I have here is how do we move from a kind of more kind of ethnic group identification, although we still have that. You can have people like the Kurds or people in the kind of Caucasus Mountains still, in different parts of the Mideast and Central Europe. There's still parts of the world that still have ethnic groups. But there's that seemed to be more weighed upon previous centuries than it is now. Now it is more by you're from this country or this country or this country or this nation state. And so why have we tried to move away from identifying based on, well, in this region, this is where this ethnic group lives, and this is their kind of territory, to more of, well, this is just the country of, et cetera, and there's a bunch of different ethnic groups there. So yeah, give us the terms, the 3 there that I listed, and then this idea of why we move from more ethnic group identification to national identity.
Okay, sure. So on the terms, there are, of course, different definitions for nationalism in particular. I offer kind of a broad definition, which is the idea that nationalism expresses a variety of concepts of nations and differing goals, that nationalism well, I suppose at essence, it encompasses the idea that a nation exists and should have some rights to self-rule, but self-rule could mean autonomy rather than having a state. So if we're talking about when nations need to have their own state, that I use a specific term, which is nation statism. Though scholars of nationalism, again, they could very well use nationalism to imply nation statism. And I think the most common way of thinking about nationalism is the idea of making political boundaries and the boundaries of the nation coincide. But there are other ways of thinking about nationalism. And just, if I may also throw out, the concept of the nation state assumes that the state serves as a territorial home for a particular nation and allows its self-determination. And there's also kind of implied here the idea of equality for people that belong to the nation. Now, on the other question, well, how do we move from ethnic groups to nations? And the literature on nationalism has challenged the idea that that nations are basically ethnic groups that have the idea that they are nations and should have rights to self-rule. So there's no kind of general principle that ethnic groups become nations, and that's how we get nations. And of course, once nationalism gains traction, and once you have more and more states created when nationalism is an important ideology, I think that this offers incentives for enterprising individuals in ethnic groups to use the language of nationalism. But I can't offer you a general principle that applies in every case. But just to say that scholars are a bit skeptical that this is how we have nations. It's simply ethnic groups that have used the language of nationalism.
Yeah, that's great. I think as is true, I think through much of these things, there's not a one size fits all. So it's interesting to see how there's different permeations of this. And I guess in terms of introductory kind of pieces here, kind of connected with that, again, big topic. I talked about it a long time ago on the podcast, this idea of sovereignty and who has the rights to various areas. And so you mentioned modular nationalism. You can briefly mention that here, but how do we understand this idea of sovereignty? Who has the rights to certain areas? And people people have and still fight over land, and who's saying, this is our land, this is yours, this is our area, this isn't. So we still have that literal fight today, but it was obviously more pronounced, centuries ago. But how do we understand this idea of sovereignty and rights to certain areas for certain groups?
Sure, and I would challenge, it wasn't necessarily, it's not necessarily that the fights over land are so much less today. They can certainly shift. But let me just take a step back for a moment and mention that sovereignty, I think we want to distinguish, kind of take a nuanced approach. There's the concept of sovereignty, which applies that, governments have clear control over all areas of a state, versus the lived reality of sovereignty, which can be a lot more messy, particularly when foreign powers try to interfere in other states. So as far as the rights question, who has the right to various areas, we might think of two arguments that provide answers to the rights question, and they're both used by nationalists and others. But one is the idea of historic state right, that a certain nation has right to land area because in earlier times there had once been a state for that particular nation. So hence that nation should have a right to a state again. Another answer to the rights question has to do with ethnodemography in terms of who actually lives in the area. What people and do they, how do they self-identify? Are they largely of a particular nationality or ethnicity? So those are two answers to the rights question. I'm just thinking we might add in, looking at some historic cases in the Balkans. We can look at certain time periods when certain human rights violations on a fairly large scale could incline the great powers, tends to be the ones that make decisions over which territorial areas to recognize as states. But when there's a significant amount of atrocities, there might be interest in recognized states as a way of kind of protecting a people who are at risk of being targeted by the government of the area in which they reside.
Yeah, I think that's super important. It's interesting how it becomes, there's a kind of historical piece where it's like this group has been here for a while. So, or we have these ideas of, somebody might be very, very, very powerful and kind of just, sweep through. And then it's this recognition of, well, there are ethnic groups here. And what do we do about that? So again, it is a very nuanced kind of thing there of like, how do we figure this out in different parts of the world with different histories, different groups, different cultures, which is challenging.
If I can just add too, one other thing, and this is certainly true for the Balkans, for Europe, and for frankly many other parts of the world, is migration has been something. So it's hard to say that there's one group that's just always been in this certain area. And we know, living in our time, that there are a number of reasons for large-scale migrations to happen, and they can certainly have an effect on identity.
In a more current context, here in the States, people talk often about immigration. Obviously, not just in the States; they talk about it around the world. But the immigration issue or question that people talk about in the States, and when I have conversations with people about this, I always tell them, I say, listen, in my view, this is one side of a coin. You think of a coin, and on one side you have immigration, but on the other side you have nationalist ideas. Not in a kind of pejorative way, but in a way of how do people figure out the country that they want to have, or they do have, or they have had, or that they want to have. And so anytime you're having this conversation about immigration, usually it comes up to, if you want to use the sanitized version of patriotism or some kind of national identity or how we do things. That to me is where I think a lot of that passion comes from is, well, we have established things, or we have these things the way we do them, and this role of immigration, especially for a large country like the US, becomes so charged up is because it really is, people are asking, how do we want to identify as a nation, and how much is, this kind of mix. I don't know how you think about it, but that's how it seems to me about this idea of these two questions are always at the same time.
Well, immigration, it's not always the political hot potato that it is in recent years. And of course, there are a number of factors related to whether or not immigration becomes politicized. It's probably something that I wouldn't want to get into in any great depth here, but and I think it often depends on, do politicians in the country experiencing waves of migration, can they benefit from kind of making it into an issue? Because the U.S., of course, like countries like Australia, countries that were kind of formed immigrant nations, if you will. So there's a certain oddness for immigrant nations in a way to kind of for immigration to be politicized, but nevertheless it has, and times change, and ideas of what the nation is, what the American nation is, that's changed over time. But ultimately, I tend to think of it, if politicians can benefit from focusing on immigration, then they will. I was just reading recently about the size of the debt in the U.S. now, and that's actually not a political issue, but it certainly could be. And I guess for whatever reason, it's just not being politicized right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you hear it every now and then pop up, but it is
Right.
significantly bloated for sure.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll try and go through maybe some more than others, kind of the major sections you have in the book, those chapters I was mentioning. So we'll start with the Americas. So obviously the Americas is up and down the Western Hemisphere, North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean. So you spend time talking about the United States, obviously, and then also going all the way down to South America as well. Super interesting. I think that there's this interesting idea of kind of throughout the story we get in primary school and secondary school and all these things is that we have this idea that, well, the British came and they overtook various native groups in the U.S. You have that story too. Spain came to Central and South America and the Caribbean, and they took over. And just to clarify, obviously horrific things happened. Obviously there was wiping out of people. Obviously there was, just horrendous things. And you're not saying that. I'm not saying that. But there's this kind of flattened approach, that this very easy story of that everyone just resisted, or everyone and that everyone that came here was barbaric, is maybe not quite the way it seems. So what's the bigger story here? You can start with the U.S. If you want, but there were some people in the U.S. at the time, I guess the colonies, that were receptive to a monarch rule. That there's these emerging states that did not always overlap with distinct identities. So kind of tell us the story, I guess, in the U.S., and then we can kind of go to, and you can throw in the American Revolution and stuff. But then we can talk about in the Caribbean as well, because you spend some time there, and it's some similarities and differences. So yeah, what's the kind of more nuanced story in your mind on this?
Right. Okay. So, once again, whether it's the American Revolution or Spanish America, Portuguese America, we might easily explain the emergence of states out of empire by pointing to nationalist movements that argued that, well, America, the U.S. is a nation, it needs its state, and the same thing for the first order sections of the Spanish Empire. But there's a more complicated story here. And for example, the historians of the American Revolution, not all of them, but there's an increase in looking at the American Revolution, in fact, as a civil war, is paying more attention to support for monarchism in the Americas. And of course, many, tens of thousands of British supporting Americans left, during the American Revolution. I don't have the figures offhand, but I believe it's in the tens of thousands. But there were still supporters of on people willing to fight for the British side in the 13 colonies. And the historian who I think is most well known for advancing the idea of the American Revolution as a civil war is John Shai, in his book A People Numerous and Armed. So that's just one example, and I've I occasionally talk about the American Revolution with my colleagues and other historians who know something about the American Revolution. I happen to think that the American rebels couldn't have done it without France. But of course, France kind of waited to see, could the rebels really pull it off? And once they did, it seems like they were, then they started to help the rebels. So we need, the U.S., the early U.S. ultimately needed France. And France wanted to have, was interested in the Americas, wanted to gain influence, and of course, supporting a new state out of British territory would be a way of undercutting Britain. Right, so great power politics is a part of the creation of America. So ultimately, the historiography. If we think about the 13 colonies, if people had an identity, it was likely associated with the colony they were in, perhaps the town they lived in. We don't really have this overriding sense of being an American, although chances are the people who fought for the revolution very likely developed some kind of consciousness of being an American. So ultimately, there's a more complicated story now with the American Revolution than the one that we were taught in school, years ago. So, similar thing for Spanish America. Well, similar in a general sense. In the historiography, there's a challenge, again, to the idea that national movements broke apart the Spanish Empire.
Right.
And it was more the focus now is on Napoleon's invasion of Spain and Portugal, and then what happens after that. In a way, the interruption of Spanish rule in the Americas because France takes over Spain. Britain then supports the emerging insurgency in Spain. And this, I would argue, allows for an even longer time period of uncertainty in the Americas as to what's going to happen in Spanish America in particular. And this time allows for debates for sovereignty to emerge. It allows for elections to emerge. And certainly in the early days after Napoleon invades Spain and Portugal, in the early days, there are these movements for home rule by a small number of elite Creoles, or again, the American-born descendants of the Spaniards, but they don't start out by demanding independence from Spain. It's more kind of home rule under empire, under the Spanish Empire. And the historiography really shows us that it takes a lot to get these demands for home rule to shift over to demands for separation from Spain. We tend to see a stronger emergence of these demands after the Spanish King Ferdinand VII, after he returns from France. He imposes repressive rule. He launches a counterinsurgency campaign in the Americas, and it's that time. I think he returns to Spain in 1813, and then all this starts around 1815, and then we start to see the demands for separation from empire picking up speed. Not everywhere. There's a lot of variation, and I would refer to listeners who want to know more about the complex story. I would refer them to two books. One is the book The Independence of Spanish America by Jaime Rodriguez O, and O is the abbreviation for his last name. He really started this, as far as I understand, started this wave of new thinking about independence in Spanish America, focusing on Napoleon's invasions as a catalyst, and then looking at the more complex story of what happens after that. I would also recommend Brian Hamnett's book, The End of Iberian Rule on the American Continent, 1770 to 1830. Both books go into greater detail than what we'll have time for here.
That's great. Yeah, I guess why I could see some resistance to this, and maybe it's because I think typically the pushback I could hear on this for these types of ways of looking at it is, well, trying to say that there were other people that were fine with, a monarchy rule, or fine with people that were coming in, invading, that it sort of takes away, or we're not focused on the horrors of, raping and pillaging and killing and all of these things. And so it's almost like a kind of way of trying to clean it up a bit, to say, yeah, but it was, not everybody was on board with it. And yeah, there was some people that wanted to keep doing this. I mean, what do you think about, I mean, you can do this on up and down the, throughout the Americas. I don't know how I feel about that, but I don't know. What do you think about maybe some of those claims about trying to have a more nuanced view from like the kind of general story we're kind of told?
Well, your comments bring to mind, and now I'm really thinking off the top of my head. I was just thinking about the variation between the Balkans and Spanish America and other parts that, of course, saw atrocities. But I think particularly in the initial conquering, the Spanish conquering of the native lands initially, even more so than during what's known in hindsight as the Wars of Independence. I think that the years for that were 1810 to 1826, and certainly, nasty things happened. But at the same time, the literature says that slaves, ex-slaves, people of mixed race fought on both sides of the conflict. So with that, it's not clear how the new states should be recognized for particular identities, in the way that in the Balkans, when there's significant unrest. Well, like, for example, the Ottoman Empire thought that it is lawful to kill people if they were rebelling. So that was legal in the Ottoman Empire. So they could hence have a significant and brutal response to rebellion in the Balkans. And because of the Ottoman Balkans' proximity to Europe, and of course to European great power politics, its proximity to Britain's, for example, the route from Britain to India, its prized colony. The Balkans has much greater geopolitical significance. And it also is if we look at Greece, Greece becomes a very important part of what it means to be European, and by extension, supporting the Greeks in their war with the Ottoman lands. And we don't really see this sort of thing in the Americas, and it's, in a sense, because of the importance of Greece, and also the reporting on Ottoman atrocities against Christians, that leads to interest in European powers' intervention, not just to support the Greeks, but also in subsequent times, in the later 1800s. And there are also a couple of other interventions in what we might call the western part of the Middle East. But we don't really see this kind of language happening, during the Wars of Independence in the Americas. It's just not. Atrocities aren't leading to the idea of a possible European intervention.
Interesting. That's very, very interesting. So I'm glad you brought up Greece, because we can move over there.
Okay.
The Greek Revolution is interesting. Many times people see it as this big form of this expression of liberalism. But you talk about it being a largely elite-run affair, which I thought was really fascinating. So you can tell us all about that. And you talk about how there's this evolution from local tradition, power structures, and landscapes into this unitary conflict. So how was there not necessarily this idea of pushing for liberalism or Greek nationality or things like this? You can bring in the Ottoman Empire if you want to set us up, because obviously, the way, again, things look on a map today is a little bit different. Today I think North Macedonia is a very small country, but Macedonia as a region was quite large. Greece was much smaller. Obviously, this is all within the Ottoman Empire, which was very large and kind of the central nucleus in Istanbul, modern-day Istanbul, and much of modern-day Turkey. So anyways, you can kind of set us up with the Ottoman Empire, but then tell us what the Greek Revolution was about.
Right. Well, of course, the Greek Revolution, a really complicated event, and one that, going into it, I think, the stereotypical understanding of, well, there was a Greek people in the Ottoman lands, and they were being oppressed, and they needed a state of their own. That's kind of the simple logic to it, and it is indeed a complex story. We might refer back to the Ottoman Empire's way of organizing or providing non-territorial autonomy for different religious traditions. The Ottoman Empire, of course, privileged Islam. So Muslims, in this hierarchy, this religious hierarchy, Muslims were at the top of it, but Christians, Orthodox Christians, of which the Greeks emerge out of, they have their own millet, their own bit of autonomy. So some scholars might argue that, well, the Greeks and other identities emerge out of the millet system and emerge out of the fact that Christians had, in a sense, second-class status in the empire. But ultimately, with the Greek Revolution, we have a number of different actors, but I would say very significant for Greece becoming thought of as a nationalist revolt is we have a number of Greeks who settled in Europe, or people of Greek background, descendants of Greeks who settled in Europe, outside of the Ottoman Empire, and they've become familiar with the reigning ideas of the day. And this is, of course, the Greek Revolution. It starts in 1821, and this is just 6 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which end in about 1815. So there are, for one thing, a lot of demobilized soldiers running around. Europe, who could be interested in fighting another war. There's also, economic times are kind of rough. War, much as we don't like war, it can really stimulate economies. So once, the Napoleonic Wars end, economic conditions become a bit more challenging for Greeks involved, known for being involved in merchant shipping and other forms of trade that could benefit from the Napoleonic Wars. But ultimately, there's an intellectual component to Greek nationalism that's attuned to the ideas associated with the French Revolution, and become enamored of the idea of applying them to the Greeks, to the Peloponnese, the southernmost part of Greece today. So we have, this group of people called basically the newcomers, who are people of Greek descent, some of which only arrive in around the time of the uprising. So they don't necessarily have a lot of ties. They don't necessarily have a power base, but they're interested in kind of applying some of the ideas coming out of the French Revolution. Also the idea of having constitutional government. But they are quite a different group, or the newcomers are quite different from the locals, who've lived there, for much of their lives. And the local elite, for example, wouldn't necessarily overwhelmingly embrace some of the new ideas about government, coming out of the French Revolution. The historiography states that it's more likely that the local elites just wanted more autonomy. There were, there are a couple of different theories as to why the Greek Revolution started when it did start. The one that I tend to rely on is the idea that the Sultan of the time, Mahmud VII, was busy trying to re-centralize power and kind of going after some of the local, what we might call warlords, and one of them in particular known as Ali Pasha. So that has something to do with why the particular timing that it had. But in terms of the local elites, chances are they just wanted to rule themselves, and they were willing to adopt whatever ideology of the time seemed appealing. And liberalism, coming out of the French Revolution, it seemed appealing. But at the same time, the local elites wouldn't necessarily know that the more conservative great powers like Prussia, Russia, and Austria wouldn't really like to support a liberal revolt, but they could be more comfortable supporting a revolt that had to do with protecting Christians from Ottoman rule. So ultimately, the chapter on Greece is a story about how these two different factions and there are more factions than this. I'm oversimplifying the story a bit.
Sure.
But how the newcomers are able to help change the messaging in the Greek Revolution to make it more appealing to the conservative European powers, and that ultimately lets more of them get on board with eventually recognizing a Greek state. And for listeners who want to read more on the Greek Revolution, I recommend the book by Mark Mazur. It came out just a couple of years ago called The Greek Revolution, 1821 and the Making of Modern Europe. And quite frankly, if I had known, the chapter on Greece was drafted probably the third year or fourth year into this project. But if I had known about this book by Mazur, I probably wouldn't have written the Greek, the chapter on Greece. I think the one thing I emphasize more than Mazur does is the likely importance for local elites of seeing that there were other local elites that were able to have their autonomous areas in the Ottoman Empire. So if others could have autonomy, why couldn't the Greek landowners on the Peloponnese? So Mazur doesn't emphasize that as much, but he's got some really interesting ideas, which I then, once I read his book, I kind of imported into my chapter, of course, with citations to his book, to add a little bit of complexity to what is already a complex revolution.
Yeah, so the simplified version is kind of like I got that version too. There's a kind of uprising, et cetera. But in terms of this, a kind of certain elite groups kind of seeing out for their interest, was it something that became a bunch of elite groups started noticing a bunch of other people doing this and saying, you know what, we should coalesce together and try to get this, all going? Or so kind of sort of by accident of sorts? Or because it doesn't sound like there was this grand plan or something of like we're gonna have this uprising and we're gonna fight back against empire. It sounds more of a kind of, there's a bunch of different elite groups that are more or less doing things for their own interests, but sort of generally kind of the same. Again, it's pretty complex. I mean, how do we see like the picture you're laying out, and from the book you reference as well, kind of with the standard story we get, how do we see that in a kind of convergence or still a more divergence of that?
Well, again, it is just so complicated, and because the Balkans, it's a mountainous region, and
Right.
of course this is well before television, social media. So you had, and interestingly enough, as an aside, in the social science research on civil wars, when we look at, well, what are the variables that tend to make civil wars more likely? And mountainous regions tends to be correlated with civil war, although we don't really know what's the mechanism that drives that exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So my guess, and again, I'm not a historian of Greece, so I have not been in the archives myself, but I can only guess that there was a lot of variety because of the challenges of communication in a more mountainous region. And although there still certainly was some communication and an awareness of amongst the elites, I mean, the smart ones would have been kind of paying attention to what's going on nearby. But I'm not able to offer you more than kind of a guess as to how living in a mountainous region would have affected their activity.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, it is. In reading the chapter, I was kind of struck by how I'm not obviously well read on this either, but how complicated it was, and it's like, oh my goodness. So there's other stories as well that are complicated just for various reasons, different groups, different interests, position, location, terrain. But the Greek story is or the Greek Revolution is complex. So there's more to mind there.
If I may add, there's also this, just like I mentioned in the American Revolution. There's more recently an interest in thinking about it as a civil war. The early stages of the Greek Revolution certainly appear to be more like a civil war, and ironically, once the Ottomans seem to be dominating or kind of getting the revolt under control, then the European powers become a little bit more interested in helping the Greeks, although there could also be, and for Britain in particular, some scholars think that, well, it was this humanitarian impulse in the British public and other publics in Europe to help the Greeks. I'm not convinced that it was humanitarianism that led the British to eventually come around to recognizing a Greek state. But the British were certainly concerned about the route to their prized colony of India. So that's why they care about the Mediterranean. They care about not letting Russia dominate, because Russia could potentially cut off their route to India. So that's why they care. And of course, the British public, is a public that is paying attention to what's happening to Christians in the Balkans. So issues of atrocities against Christians can certainly become news. But let me also point out that the Greek Revolution started in 1820, you might say, until 1830, when Greece is kind of effectively recognized, but borders aren't yet finalized until, I think, 1832. And many people, many Orthodox Christians, not all of them, of course, thought of themselves as Greeks, but many of them died because of starvation and exposure, not because of battle deaths. Right.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how certain things play out and certain reasons why people are joining a cause or not joining a cause, especially when you have something that's at least a decade long, which is very interesting. So let's move to the Balkans. So in the book, you have this chapter on the Balkans and Anatolia. So for listeners, Anatolia is much of modern day Turkey. I think it's a large percentage of modern day Turkey, and so I guess the question is, why put those together? I guess, how do you see the link between them? Obviously, this is again still within towards late Ottoman period, but you talk about various things that are going on in the Balkan states, and you even have certain kind of subsections within that chapter about with Romania and Albania, and obviously you talk about Turkey. So you can hit this however you want. I know you've done a lot of research on this. So Yeah, tell us about the general makeup of the Balkans. What are the current nation states? But how did they break up into these smaller states, post-Ottoman? And yeah, what's the story there that is really, really, really fascinating?
Okay. Well, I think many of your listeners, when they hear the term the Balkans, they probably think of this hotbed of nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
The word Balkan could be used as a synonym as really like extremist nationalist. But ironically, looking back at the historiography, the Balkans, it took a lot for nationalism to gain traction in the Balkans, despite its proximity to Europe and the emergence of nationalism really coming out of Western Europe. The Balkans, an area, part of it's mountainous, part of it less so, but also subject to waves of migration. So it's changed over the course of time. In the Ottoman period, which, as you stated earlier, ends around World War One, tended to be mostly inhabited by peasants. So it's doesn't have a large middle class. Again, the millet system means that Muslims are kind of on the top of the hierarchy. But at the same time, that Christian populations, for example, Armenians, are able to link up, or at least not all Armenians, but amongst the Armenian elite, had contact with other great powers, and for some time in the Ottoman Empire, although this is going back, I think, in earlier periods, before the Greek Revolution, the Phanariots were influential, and they were linked with Greek culture. But ultimately, out of the place of Christians in the Ottoman Empire becomes this idea, well, that the Christians they're officially second, kind of second class, but yet they are, in some cases, wealthier, more connected with the European powers. So there ends up being this kind of resentment towards the Christians for that. And at the same time, you have occasionally European powers actually intervening in periods of revolt. And then that leads to, not only with Greece, but there's a wave of rebellion in the Balkans, starts in 1875, and then extends. And the outcome of that, it's complex rebellion, although largely peasant rebellion, with some claims of separatist nationalist claims. But out of that, we have, in 1878 at the Congress of Berlin, we have recognized new states of Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro. We have a Bulgarian autonomy recognized at the time. And that, although eventually, Bulgaria would go on at a weak moment for the Ottoman Empire to declare its independence in not long thereafter. So ultimately, based on what I've been saying, it might make some sense that at least some Muslims in the Ottoman Empire might be a little bit worried about Christian populations. Despite, for example, at one point in time, the Armenians are known as the most loyal millet to the Ottoman regime. So it is complicated. But in my book chapter on Balkans and Anatolia, one reason why they're together is because I draw attention to the Balkan Muslim refugees become an important force in the Unionist Party in Turkey, that becomes known as a nationalist party. And what I see in my reading of the historiography is that the Balkan Muslims, because they have outsized influence in the late days of Ottoman Turkey, are kind of the force behind making Turkey into a more Turkish nation state. The idea of having minorities is something that can invite great power intervention and then ultimately lead to the expulsion of minorities. So it would seem like, from the experience of the Balkan Muslim refugees, that Turkey could ultimately, once it's officially recognized, be safer in a way if it's more overwhelmingly Turkish.
Mm.
So, but ultimately the book tries to show that just it takes a lot for the Balkans and Anatolia. And again, you're right to say Anatolia is basically the area of Turkey today. Areas that we tend to think are strongly nationalist, but it took quite a lot for that to happen. Another thing that I discovered in my reading is during the World War I period, when it seems like, the simple story is that Turkish nationalism was so powerful that it brought down the Ottoman Empire with Mustafa Kemal, the famous general that we tend to call Ataturk. He seems to be just a Turkish nationalist, but the historiography coming out now tends to emphasize anti-Westernism, Muslim internationalism. So it's not just a story of nationalism. The historiography is paying attention to other ideas for reform. For example, I might point to the historian Adam Mestian, who I think you interviewed.
Yeah.
He has a fascinating article that poses the question of why wasn't the dualist model in Austria-Hungary applied to the Ottoman Empire. And when I say dualist model, in 1867 in the Habsburg Empire, Hungary was recognized as having its own autonomy, and then really fought in a general sense to keep. There was talk of recognizing another autonomous area, perhaps a Slavic, area, as autonomous. So there was talk about, reforming the Ottoman Empire, of adopting the dualist model from the Austro-Hungarian Empire into the Ottoman Empire. Although that, as we know, that wasn't actually the route that ended up being taken. But my chapter on the Balkans and Anatolia, again, it shows readers what were the different ideas for reform. It has sections on the areas that would become recognized as independent states, and kind of describes their different experiences, and ultimately to show that separatist nationalism was not a long time preference for even most elites necessarily. It was something that kind of came about, and then once you had either new autonomies recognized or new states recognized in the Balkans, then there are the institutions like administrations and schools that can help promote a particular national identity. Of course, nationalists can write histories, and then to make nationalism seem a lot more powerful and important for the creation of new states than it actually was.
I want to come back to Kemal and kind of the creation of Turkey, if you will. But Adam Meshdayan was great. He has a fabulous book. It's a modern Arab kingship. It's a really, really great book about kind of nation states post late Ottoman. Then we talk about a lot of those themes. So yeah, he was wonderful to talk to. I guess the question I have here, just before we go back to Turkey, is there was this interesting thing you mentioned about Serbia and Montenegro, about as there was a lot of there's been a lot of things written about why, especially late Ottoman period, what happened to the breaking up of the Ottoman Empire. And so the last couple of decades seem to be some fractures there in the structure. And I guess the question I have here is, how did Serbia and Montenegro both try to take advantage of various Ottoman weaknesses? It looks like success, more or less, for Montenegro, but less so of success for Serbia. Obviously, they're closely bordering each other in current modern maps drawn on a globe. But how did these two places have different results, even though they're not that far apart, trying to take advantage of the Ottoman weakness for their own independence?
Right. Well, Montenegro, quite a mountainous area, and it would allow for natural defense because of that, was never fully integrated into the Ottoman Empire. It kind of just had its own autonomy. So I think geography explains the variation, even though I don't really emphasize that quite a lot in the book. But in terms of Serbia, Russia has to intervene to kind of help out Serbia, and at that particular time, Britain, another major player, has a policy of non-interference. And again, we have metastasizing rebellion in the Balkans starting in 1875. I point out that this is following or in the midst in the midst of another economic downturn. So we could say that there are economic factors behind the rebellion. There's the long-standing grievance we might point out again that Christian populations have, they have second-class status. Although certainly there were cases of the nobles, the nobility, or actually that's not quite the right term, the local notables for in the Balkans potentially taking advantage of the peasants. And even though the notables tended to be Muslim and the peasants tended to be Christian, it wasn't always the case, but that tended to be the case. So the religious difference could kind of add to the circumstance. But again, a lot of variation in the Balkans. Part of my chapter on the Balkans talks about, even though we might, in hindsight, look at rebellion and unrest as nationalist, there could be a number of factors driving it. One could simply be a reaction to local notables. They were overtaxing the Christian populations. They were responding to the Ottoman regime or some other factor. So I don't want to say that it was always, just unrest or rebellion was always a response to one thing. The chapter kind of points out the various reasons for rebellion and unrest because, a book, my book, the main text is under 200 pages. So I can't go into great detail for every particular case, but I offer the reader, some ideas of what could have been driving rebellion and to indicate that separatist nationalism was just one of a number of things that could drive rebellion. But the Serbia that emerged was recognized in 1878, not nearly as large as Serbia today. So it was a smaller territorial area. Once the new Balkan states are recognized, after Greece, again, then it's Serbia, Montenegro, Romania, with then a Bulgarian autonomy, and then before a new state emerging, I believe it's 1908. But then we have the Balkan states trying to expand using irredentism in a way, or in the case of because national identity hadn't penetrated the mostly rural peasant population, there was this battle for the hearts and minds of the local population amongst Romanian, Bulgarian, Greek, and Serbian nationalists. So you see this kind of battle for, again, the hearts and minds of the local population that wasn't necessarily thinking that it was nationalist.
Yeah. So let's talk about Turkey real quick, and then shortly after Armenia. So you talk about Ataturk, major figure, Turkey wanting to be post-Ottoman, this kind of secular state, having their own language, et cetera, all of these things. But you mentioned something earlier, which I wanted to just kind of hone in on, which I thought was fascinating. I hadn't heard that bit of it. You talked about how unionists tried to make this ethnically homogenized Turkish nation state with all of these refugee, dominated leaderships. You had mentioned that earlier. Talk a little bit more about that in this new kind of post-Ottoman Turkish country, this nation state. Why the emphasis of why those efforts to have these ethnically homogenized states with refugee leadership? What's going on there?
Well, I should point out it's not only refugees that are in leadership positions. There are certainly others.
Sure.
But yeah, and that is a really good question of why make Turkey such an ethnically homogenous nation state? Because ultimately it was the military and political successes of Ataturk that led to the recognition of a larger Turkey than the European great powers had initially anticipated. I mean, the European powers, for example, in the treaty of Sèvres, imagined that kind of the divvying up of Turkey between the European powers, and also potentially allowing for a state, for an Armenian state. But ultimately the success of Ataturk led to the recognition of a much larger state. Although, by the way, Ataturk did have significant assistance from the Soviet Union, which we don't often read about. So, but nevertheless, even after its creation, there are efforts undertaken to make Turkey a more ethnically homogeneous state. Of course, many will remember the Ottoman genocide during World War I, and I think based on some Ottoman fears of Armenians potentially helping Russia during the war, of being in a sense assisting a great power. So that's part of the reason for why for the Armenian genocide ultimately. But yeah, there's again, my argument is based on the particular experience of the Balkan Muslim refugees who were forced from where they lived, whether recognized or as an autonomy or a state in the Balkans. Whenever there was a new entity recognized, we tended to see forced migrations of Muslim populations, because the new states tended to be, with the exception of Albania, they tended to be Christian states, and then we tended to see forced migrations of Muslims, and some of it was voluntary, but ultimately the Balkan Muslim refugees in Turkey had a different experience, and perhaps worried a bit more about the security of Turkey and wanted it to survive. And making it an ethnically homogeneous state, it would seem to be security enhancing. And this is the same idea that in the beginning of our conversation, I remember I told you about my fascination with Central and Eastern Europe, and how the earlier vision was, or at least the vision after World War II, kind of bringing the earlier vision for the Balkans, applying it to Central Europe, was the need to make more ethnically homogeneous states, because then you don't have people like Adolf Hitler claiming the need to protect Germans in the Sudetenland, which was the northern border area of Czechoslovakia. So then, of course, after World War II, then the Western powers agreed to what was known again as the population transfers of Germans from Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, with the idea, particularly for Czechoslovakia and Poland, that doing that would make irredentism less likely. So you might say a similar line of thinking, again, that better to have a homogeneous Turkey to not invite foreign powers interference. And that's a bit of an oversimplification, but it might help us understand, what the trends of the time and how people were thinking about security and minority populations, despite the fact that, after World War I, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson spearheaded this idea of the League of Nations and of fundamentally changing international relations, making them less about great power politics and paying closer attention to what people actually wanted. Wilson believed that, there were these peoples or nations that existed in the Ottoman Empire and of course in the Habsburg Empire, and that European stability would be enhanced if they had the right to self-rule in some capacity. But of course, the League of Nations, as we know, we didn't survive. So there was this concern about minority populations and how they could they be given rights to self-rule, and could there be a way of making foreign powers less likely to interfere in their neighbors by the use of a co-national minority population. So these are some of the issues, and of course we're revisiting this today with Vladimir Putin's concern about Russians in Ukraine, and so the problem in some ways is being revisited at a time, I think, when many people thought that was just old history and it wasn't really going to come back.
Yeah, I wonder with the Turkish, kind of state and all that, it kind of right afterwards, this idea of ethnically homogenous again, this is my thinking on it is, well, if you've had 600 years of an empire that has all of these different ethnic groups across the empire and even many in Anatolia, I wonder if some of that was, well, we need to make it distinct, right? That it's not just, Ottoman Empire 2.0 and we're just calling it Turkey. If there was a thing of saying we are distinct and we want to do things differently, I wonder if there's a little bit of that in there. And then, yeah, I mean, we don't have to get all into it if you don't want to. I mean, Armenia is a really fascinating place, super complex history. And I've heard in other conversations here that Armenia poses this really interesting or critical space because even as far back as between, Roman and Persian empires, it sits right in these mountains and it's kind of on the border of, essentially, if you want, west and east, but it's a critical place, but it has all this like pretty crazy terrain with the Caucasus Mountains. And, I've heard people on both sides of this. I've heard the Turkish kind of standard statement about the Armenian genocide. I've obviously heard the Armenian side of things as well. There is this kind of strange dynamic of being very aligned with the Ottoman Empire initially and then not. There's Soviet Union influence, and then there's all these things. And of course, at the end of the day, there's a horrific genocide that happens. But I mean, you don't have to. We can skip it if you want, because I know it's kind of it's still a kind of hot issue of sorts. But maybe just speak on, if you want, the complexity Armenia presents in this period, and some of the interactions with late Ottoman and then post-Ottoman, if you want.
Right. Well, I guess maybe I'll just point out how Armenian activists and Armenian populations existed both in the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, which, and if you remember, over the course of time, the Russian Empire expands and kind of takes some Ottoman territory, and right. That's part of the reason for why the Ottoman Empire becomes known as the sick man of Europe. Although it's kind of overdone in that the Ottoman regime was a bit stronger than what this stereotype of the sick man of Europe implies. But you can just by me reminding everyone that the Russian Empire was expanding. It was the dominant power in Europe after the defeat of Napoleon, certainly until the Crimean War of 1856, and then it's a bit weaker after that. But nevertheless, there's good reason for the Ottoman regime to fear the Russian Empire a bit. So when you have Armenian activists in the Ottoman Empire undertaking revolt, you might understand why the Ottoman regime would be a bit nervous about, potential support from Russia, although, Russia by that time had kind of stopped emphasizing support for Armenians who wanted to challenge the Ottoman regime, but or wanted to be active in some way. But in my characterization, I'm trying to, I guess, make it understandable why the Ottoman regime would worry about the Armenians and the potential for Russia to take advantage of them, even though the historiography, at least some of it, indicates that Russia was less interested in supporting Armenian revolt, even by the time of the period of the genocide. But nevertheless, World War I is happening. So it's a challenging period. An Ottoman Empire had joined the war on the side of the Central Powers, and of course Russia was on the other side. So this is part of the circumstance that that we see the genocide happening. But despite the interest on the European powers, and of course even the powers that fought on the other side of the war, there was an interest in recognizing a state for the Armenians. Once again, we have the case where there's significant atrocities against a population. It seems to make the case for statehood more clear for at least some powers. So there was interest amongst the European powers for an Armenian state, but ultimately this interest it was ultimately not made possible by the military and political success of Ataturk, who coming out of the World War I period, made the claim that the Armenians brought upon themselves their fate by at least having some rebels appearing that they weren't reliable. But again, the problem with for listeners who are wondering, well, why does ethnic cleansing happen? Why does genocide happen? And the Armenian case is like any number of other cases. It's an overreaction to rebellion. That's in most cases it's there aren't a lot of rebels. They're a very small portion of even the Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire. But yet there's this overreaction and this fear about all Armenians and the need to keep the rebellion from spreading. And we just see this over and over again, this overreaction to rebellion that makes me quite frankly skeptical that we'll ever see an end to ethnic cleansing and genocide because of the potential for such overreaction. So in my understanding of this period, that's I understand how the fear of the rebellion and of it spreading, but at the same time, there's not enough self-awareness on all parties to realize that not everyone of the same identity is necessarily going to be a rebel. So I guess to put it another way, it's hard to be nuanced during wartime. Yeah. But that's really what's most needed to make ethnic cleansing and genocide less likely.
Yeah. That's super helpful to to think about and to consider for sure. Well, there's so many other things that I wish we could get to. We have Central Europe, Asia, and Africa. So we'll just have to encourage listeners to go and pick up your wonderful book and read about that and everything else. So my last question for you, though, is how do we have this nuanced view of empire? Many people have this very negative view. Empire is all bad. It's always bad. That's it. It's only a horrible thing. And if you say anything positive about empire, you're definitely spreading imperialism and all these things or whatever, or some version of ugly nationalism. How do we have this larger discussion of nation states, nationalism? We coalesce around something. We coalesce around ethnicity. We coalesce around religion. We coalesce around a monarchy. And some people coalesce around nation states. And so how do we have, many of the things you've said, I'm sure listeners will hear. You've mentioned, the Russia-Ukraine war. You've mentioned other things that still go on in the world. So this isn't something that's going away. So how do we have this view of empire, nation states, nationalism, and how we understand these issues today?
Well, of course, I wouldn't want to offer my view as the only way of looking at this. This is something that, up for discussion, but...
Of course.
Right. But, the historiography that I've been drawing from, certainly admits that, there were certain hierarchies within empire. Mm-hmm. That was what empire was about ultimately. And then at least the ideal nation state, everyone within the nation is equal. But of course, there are different types of nationalism, and there's this standard dichotomy between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. And civic is one that has you might say, a thinner vision of the nation, one that can encompass different ethno-national identities. Like here in the U.S., you can be Pakistani American, Somali American, you can have these other identities, but in an ethnic-oriented nation, it's more based on bloodlines and who your relatives are, how they identified. So there's less room for diversity within empire. So I would say, for anyone who really thinks, there's no going back to empire, nation states, that's where it is. Well, we were just talking about ethnic cleansing and genocide. And in modern times, it seems to me that you need that celebration of the nation state. One of the downsides of that is that when you have a more ethnic oriented concept of the nation, that doesn't always leave room for minority populations. And then, of course, there's the possibility of foreign powers trying to gain influence in a country by trying to influence minority populations. That can certainly happen. And even when it doesn't, conspiracy theories could circulate to suggest that the minorities are helping a foreign power. So there's always this risk, at least from what I can see, that minority populations might not be as reliable as the kind of majority nation. So with that, there's this risk of ethnic cleansing and genocide with the nation state. So that's the downside of it. And, if someone wants to kind of assuming that they accept my idea that you need to have the nation state as being an important or foundation for political legitimacy, to have mass ethnic cleansing and genocide. And if that's true, someone could very well try and calculate, how many people have been affected by ethnic cleansing and genocide. And of course, it's not only the people who've died or been injured, but it's also the impact to the families and communities that they're part of. Does that outweigh the downsides of empire? And I'm not really sure that it does. I'm not ready to say that one is always better than another. I mean, it would be nice if people could, have a more nuanced approach to diversity within countries. But that's not necessarily always easy to do, and particularly in wartime.
Yeah.
But ultimately, if we see nation states, in a sense, as important for ethnic cleansing and genocide, we might not be quite as excited about the idea of the nation state as clearly superior to empire. But ultimately, as far as I know, there's no perfect way of organizing ourselves, at least not yet.
Yeah. No, I would absolutely agree. It really is a organizational kind of thing, and you have so many different variables that you're trying to organize, and in a more modern age, or I should say a digital age, everyone's connected much more easily than they were even 100 years ago and further back. So that's a whole other wrinkle as well. Lynn, this was so much fun. I greatly enjoyed this conversation. I loved your book. I love thinking about these topics and these issues. So big thanks for coming on and for giving us letting us download all of your information. It was really just quite pleasant.
All right. Well, thank you. You've introduced me to a few new ideas as well.
All right. Wonderful.